My name is Emily. I am 28 years old, and my father disowned me on my 18th birthday. We were standing in the middle of our grand living room, surrounded by half-empty champagne glasses and the discarded wrapping paper of a life I was about to lose forever. My father, Richard, a towering figure of 60 years old who built a real estate empire from absolutely nothing, looked at me with eyes so incredibly cold they could freeze time itself. I had just told him I wouldn't go to the elite business school he had paid for, that I wanted to study education instead. His face turned a dangerous shade of crimson I had never seen, and his voice dropped to a terrifying, quiet whisper as he pointed to the heavy oak front door, telling me that if I walked out of his carefully constructed plan, I was walking out of his family, his will, and his life permanently. My heart shattered into a million jagged pieces, tearing at my chest from the inside out, because I realized in that split second that his love for me was conditional, tied entirely to my blind obedience. I ran up the long stairs, blind with hot tears, to pack whatever I could fit into a single duffel bag, feeling like an absolute orphan while my own parents were still breathing downstairs. But just as I zipped up the bag, the door creaked open, and my mother, Sarah, 58 years old, slipped into the room with trembling hands, pressing a sealed, slightly crumpled envelope into my palm and whispering a secret that would haunt my every waking moment for the next 10 years. To fully understand the absolute gravity of that terrifying night, you have to truly understand the suffocating shadow of the man who raised me and the profound isolation I felt. Richard was not a man who ever requested things, he demanded them, and his entire existence was completely built on absolute, unyielding control over every single variable in his daily life. I spent my entire childhood desperately trying to mold myself into the perfect miniature version of him, swallowing my own dreams just to see a fleeting, rare nod of approval from across his massive mahogany desk. The only person who truly understood the immense depth of my daily misery was my best friend Jessica, a 28-year-old girl with a heart of absolute gold, who had been my emotional anchor since middle school. A week before my 18th birthday, I was having a complete, hyperventilating panic attack about the college acceptance letters I was hiding, and Jessica just held my shaking hand tightly, her voice steady and fiercely protective. She told me that surviving a wealthy prison was still just surviving a prison, planting the seed of rebellion that ultimately led to my devastating exile into the completely unforgiving, cold, real world. The brutal reality of being completely cut off hit me like a speeding freight train the very next morning, when I woke up on Jessica's lumpy sofa with a stiff neck and absolutely $0 to my name. My father had immediately canceled my credit cards, entirely drained my personal savings account, which he was a joint holder on, and even maliciously disconnected my phone plan, leaving me completely stranded. My mother's frantic parting words echoed constantly in my mind, telling me that he had written that mysterious letter the night before, but I was strictly forbidden from opening it until I felt truly lost or built something of my own. I had to painfully swallow every single ounce of pride I had ever possessed and walk into a greasy local diner, practically begging the manager to hire me as a waitress on the spot. For the first few agonizing months, my life was an absolute blur. Spilled hot coffee, severely aching feet, and the constant, humiliating sting of serving wealthy people who used to attend my parents' lavish dinner parties, crying myself to sleep every night. There were so many dark, incredibly freezing nights during that first brutal winter when the cheap heating in our rundown apartment broke entirely, and I would sit on the hard floor, wrapped in thin blankets, staring intensely at that sealed envelope. It sat on my cheap nightstand like an active ticking time bomb, constantly mocking my extreme poverty, whispering deceptive promises of a potential easy way out of my intense suffering. I aggressively put the letter away in a locked metal box hidden deep under my bed and completely threw myself into my studies with a level of absolute ferocity that closely bordered on complete madness. I enrolled in the local underfunded community college, taking the absolute maximum number of credits legally allowed while working double shifts at the greasy diner every single weekend to pay my half of the rent. Every single time my cheap alarm went off at 5 in the morning and my exhausted body screamed for sleep, I vividly thought about the cold, entirely dismissive look in my father's eyes, using that painful memory as unstoppable fuel to succeed. 4 incredibly exhausting, grueling years later, I finally walked across a makeshift, squeaky stage in the college gymnasium to gratefully receive my bachelor's degree in education, proudly graduating at the very top of my entire class.
Jessica was there in the very front row, screaming my name at the top of her lungs and holding a ridiculous, beautiful homemade sign. But the 2 completely empty folding chairs right next to her felt like massive, incredibly dark black holes. I had secretly, desperately mailed my parents a formal graduation announcement 2 weeks prior, a deeply pathetic part of my soul, hoping that 4 years of absolute silence would be broken by a single moment of parental pride. But they never showed up. The next few chaotic years were an absolute whirlwind of establishing myself in the incredibly harsh real world, securing a demanding position as a special education teacher at a severely underfunded public school in a tough neighborhood. I poured every single ounce of my soul into being the fiercely supportive adult these neglected kids desperately needed, building a strong reputation as a fierce advocate, and slowly, completely healing my own deep, lingering wounds. By the time I turned 26, I had incredibly managed to save up enough money, combined with a terrifyingly large small business loan, to finally realize my ultimate lifelong dream of opening my own independent community youth center. It was a massive, entirely terrifying undertaking, completely transforming an abandoned, severely dilapidated warehouse on the rough edge of town into a vibrant, incredibly safe haven filled with bright classrooms, art studios, and a fully stocked library. I poured my absolute entire life savings into the massive renovation, working late into the night painting walls, building cheap furniture, and enthusiastically recruiting passionate volunteers from the local university to help run the daily programs. When we finally opened our bright blue doors, the incredible response from the community was deeply overwhelming, with hundreds of kids flooding in every single week to find a completely safe place to learn, grow, and just peacefully be kids. As I stood in the hallway listening to the chaotic sound of children laughing, I felt an indescribable sense of pride. I had built an entire empire of my own out of raw empathy, entirely without my father's money. But the beautiful euphoria of total success is often incredibly fragile, and just 2 short years after the center opened, when I was exactly 28 years old, the solid ground beneath my tired feet completely and violently collapsed. The city suddenly announced a massive, incredibly lucrative urban redevelopment project, and the landlord of our building, a slick, ruthless corporate developer who cared about absolutely nothing but his bottom line, decided to quickly sell the entire property. I received a formal, incredibly cold eviction notice in the mail, giving us exactly 60 short days to entirely vacate the premises, completely destroying everything I had sacrificed my entire 20s to painstakingly build from the bare ground up. I was plunged into a state of absolute blinding panic, spending endless, agonizing days frantically calling unhelpful city officials, organizing loud community protests, and practically begging multiple banks for an emergency loan to somehow buy the massive building myself. But the asking price was astronomically high, entirely out of reach for a modest nonprofit center, leaving me entirely helpless and staring at absolute complete ruin. The immense, crushing stress of the impending eviction began to completely consume me, aggressively eating away at my sleep, my appetite, and my fragile sanity, until I was nothing more than a hollow, exhausted shell walking through the vibrant halls. I would look deeply at the innocent faces of the children who completely depended on me, kids who finally had a truly safe place to go after school, and the intense, agonizing guilt of failing them felt like a physical, twisted knife in my gut. One incredibly rainy, profoundly dark Tuesday evening, after the absolute last child had gone home and the massive building was eerily quiet, I just entirely collapsed onto the cold floor of my tiny office, sobbing violently and uncontrollably in the dark. It was exactly in that specific moment of absolute, entirely crushing despair, sitting on the freezing linoleum floor, surrounded by aggressive past-due bills, that my mind violently snapped back to the hidden metal lockbox waiting patiently in my dark apartment. I completely realized that I had finally hit the exact terrifying criteria my mother had warned me about. I was profoundly, entirely lost, and my beautiful creation was crumbling.
I drove home completely recklessly through the blinding torrential rain, my hands gripping the steering wheel so incredibly tightly my knuckles were completely white, my heart pounding a frantic, chaotic rhythm against my violently aching ribcage. I frantically pulled the heavy metal box out from under the massive pile of winter coats in my closet, my fingers trembling entirely uncontrollably as I aggressively fumbled with the tiny brass key that I hadn't even touched in nearly an entire decade. As the heavy lid finally popped open, revealing that slightly yellowed, deeply crumpled envelope, a massive wave of intense nausea washed over me, terrified of what agonizing words from the past were about to completely shatter my incredibly fragile present. I slowly slid my shaking thumb under the flap, the incredibly loud sound of the tearing paper echoing through the completely silent apartment like a terrifying gunshot, and pulled out 3 pages of thick, extremely expensive corporate stationery. My blurred vision immediately filled with hot, angry tears before I even read the very first word, entirely bracing my fragile soul for a brutal barrage of cruel insults or a final, devastating rejection. The letter absolutely did not start with immense anger. It did not start with bitter disappointment, but rather it started with a shockingly vulnerable, deeply painful confession from a man who had never once shown an ounce of weakness in his life. "My dearest Emily," he wrote, a beautiful, incredibly tender term of endearment he had never once used out loud in my entire life. "If you are reading this, it means you have either hit absolute rock bottom or clawed your way to the very top." He bravely went on to thoroughly explain that on the terrifying night of my 18th birthday, when I fiercely stood up to him and completely refused to follow his path, he didn't see a rebellious child, but the very best parts of himself staring back. He painfully admitted that his massive empire, his entire life's relentless work, was entirely built on a deeply rotten foundation of ruthlessness, intense paranoia, and a highly toxic need for absolute control that had entirely poisoned his own dark soul. He wrote that when he looked at my pure, beautiful heart, he realized with terrifying clarity that his massive darkness would eventually extinguish my bright light completely. I was completely paralyzed, my wide eyes darting frantically across the heavy pages as he detailed the horrific, deeply traumatizing cycle of brutal abuse he had suffered at the hands of his own cruel father, a vicious cycle he was utterly terrified of repeating. He completely confessed that his deeply controlling nature wasn't born out of a genuine desire to see me wildly succeed, but out of a deeply ingrained, completely paralyzing fear that if he didn't script my entire life, he would completely lose me to the world. But when I bravely demanded my absolute freedom, he incredibly realized the absolute only way to truly save me from becoming a cold, deeply calculated machine like him was to completely sever the tie, to forcefully become the ultimate villain so I would run away. "I absolutely had to break your precious heart in one single, incredibly clean cut," the letter read, the dark ink slightly smudged from a fallen teardrop. "Because if you stayed, I would have broken your beautiful spirit slowly, piece by agonizing piece, every single day." My hands were shaking violently as I read his tragic, deeply flawed logic of protection. But the massive, profoundly emotional bombshells absolutely did not stop there, because as I slowly turned to the third and final page, the letter entirely shifted from a heartbreaking psychological confession to a completely shocking, life-altering practical revelation. He thoroughly explained that on the exact agonizing day he forcefully kicked me out into the cold, he had secretly and legally established an ironclad blind trust entirely in my name, funding it with a massive, incredibly large portion of his personal wealth. He wrote that he absolutely knew my incredible journey would be intensely difficult, that I would brutally face extreme poverty and deep exhaustion, but he also firmly knew that the intense struggle was the only way I would forge entirely unbreakable resilience. "I completely failed to be a good father to you in person," the profoundly sad final paragraph read, "but I can proudly be the entirely silent shield that forever protects your beautiful future." The attached documents contain the access codes to the trust. I dropped the letter, realizing the entirely hidden account magically contained millions of dollars, enough to buy my center 10 times over. I instantly fell heavily forward onto my entirely bruised knees, my trembling hands violently gripping my hair
as an entire decade of deeply suppressed pain, massive anger, and absolute confusion violently erupted from my chest in agonizing, uncontrollable sobs. I had spent 10 entire, incredibly long years intensely hating him, entirely using my intense, burning rage as the primary fuel to keep me moving forward, totally painting him as an evil monster while he was secretly orchestrating my ultimate financial salvation. I desperately grabbed my phone from the messy bed and instantly dialed my mother's cell number, completely unable to process my entirely chaotic, deeply conflicted thoughts without her, listening to the phone ring 3 agonizingly, incredibly long times. When she finally picked up, her voice sounding incredibly fragile, I choked out that I had finally opened the letter, begging to know if he was still alive and if I could immediately come over to forcefully confront the man who had secretly saved me. She wept softly on the line, telling me she had waited an entire decade for this call, warning me that he was entirely broken and incredibly old now. I absolutely didn't even bother fully changing out of my completely damp, freezing clothes. I just frantically grabbed my car keys, ran blindly out into the pouring, freezing rain, and began the incredibly surreal, terrifying drive back to the massive estate. Every single agonizing mile I drove felt exactly like I was traveling rapidly backward in time, the deeply familiar street signs and massive oak trees forcefully triggering a relentless, overwhelming flood of deeply buried, painful childhood memories I had tried to erase. My mind was completely and entirely racing, desperately rehearsing a million different highly conflicting things I frantically wanted to say to him, oscillating wildly between deeply wanting to scream at him and wanting to entirely fall into his warm arms. The heavy, incredibly intimidating iron gates of the massive estate loomed darkly in the distance, looking exactly as terrifying as they did the night I was forced out. But as I rapidly pulled up, the massive gates slowly, incredibly swung open completely automatically. I drove up the long, winding cobblestone driveway, my stomach tied in 1,000 tight knots, finally returning home. As I nervously stepped out into the freezing torrential rain, the massive, deeply intimidating oak door creaked open, and my mother, Sarah, now a 68-year-old woman with entirely silver hair and deep, profound lines of sorrow, stood in the warm porch light. She immediately rushed down the dangerously slippery stone steps, completely entirely ignoring the brutal downpour, and violently wrapped her fragile, shaking arms around me in a crushing, utterly desperate hug that instantly dissolved 10 years of deep resentment. We stood completely still there in the freezing, pouring rain, crying intensely and loudly into each other's completely soaked shoulders as she frantically and repeatedly whispered endless, deeply painful apologies directly into my wet hair for not stopping him. She quickly pulled me completely inside, out of the bitter cold, and gently cupped my entirely frozen face with her trembling, warm hands, looking deeply and profoundly into my eyes, and telling me how incredibly, fiercely proud she was of the strong woman I had become. She then took a deep, entirely shaky breath and silently pointed down the long hallway directly toward his dark study. Walking incredibly slowly down that entirely familiar, dimly lit, massive hallway genuinely felt exactly like walking the terrifying Green Mile, every single profoundly heavy footstep echoing loudly against the cold marble floors, amplifying the absolute emotional gravity. I stopped completely frozen right outside the heavy, dark mahogany doors, my trembling hand nervously hovering directly over the incredibly cold brass handle, my heart hammering violently and painfully against my aching ribs as I desperately tried to summon my courage. Sitting entirely alone behind that massive, incredibly intimidating desk was my father, Richard, now a 70-year-old man who looked absolutely entirely nothing like the terrifying, invincible titan who had completely dominated my entire traumatic childhood. His incredibly broad shoulders were deeply, tragically hunched. His once-thick hair was entirely white, and he was staring entirely blankly at a small, heavily framed photograph of me when I was just 7 years old, completely unaware of my presence. When he finally lifted his heady head and his incredibly tired eyes firmly locked onto mine, the sheer, absolute vulnerability on his face completely shattered me. "You're actually here," he finally whispered, his voice incredibly rough, entirely raspy,
and devoid of absolutely any of the booming, terrifyingly commanding authority that used to violently shake the massive walls of this imposing house. I walked incredibly slowly directly toward the center of the completely silent room, tightly clutching the crumpled, slightly damp letter firmly in my right hand, and stopped exactly where I had stood 10 agonizing years ago when he brutally erased me from his life.
I read it, I forcefully said, my voice surprisingly, incredibly steady, despite the massive, chaotic, terrifying storm of deep emotions violently raging inside my chest, firmly holding the heavy pages up so he could clearly see his own confession. I spent 10 entire, incredibly long years utterly despising you, desperately building an entire, difficult life entirely out of pure spite, thinking you were an absolute monster who casually threw me away like completely worthless garbage onto the cold street. He violently squeezed his tired eyes completely shut, heavily absorbing my undeniably absolute truth. I was an absolute monster, Emily, he finally choked out, his deeply broken voice cracking violently as he desperately struggled to miraculously maintain even a tiny fraction of his former composure, looking at me with absolute, crushing desperation. I never, ever wanted to hurt you. I only desperately wanted you to be incredibly strong, to completely never have to tragically rely on a deeply broken man like me. And seeing exactly what you have beautifully built, it was worth the agony.
It absolutely wasn't your damn decision to confidently make, I suddenly and violently shouted, the deeply buried pain finally erupting forcefully from my burning throat, hot tears streaming entirely freely down my severely flushed, incredibly angry face. You absolutely didn't successfully protect me. You just completely and utterly abandoned me to fiercely suffer through freezing nights. He flinched at my incredibly harsh words and slowly, painfully walked directly around the massive desk, his deeply broken voice completely, entirely shattering as he finally fell completely to his weak knees right in front of me, looking entirely down at this broken, deeply aging man kneeling on the hard floor, the massive, incredibly terrifying giant of my entire childhood, completely reduced to a heavily weeping, deeply regretful, shattered, entirely remorseful father. I absolutely didn't want his massive wealth. I didn't want his vast corporate empire. I just desperately wanted the deeply loving father I had been completely unfairly robbed of for an entire, agonizingly long, incredibly painful decade. I slowly, carefully dropped the thick letter onto the floor, gently sank down to my entirely bruised knees right directly in front of him, and carefully, deeply wrapped my violently trembling arms entirely around his shaking, extremely frail shoulders. The absolute massive wave of profound forgiveness entirely washed over us, completely setting the absolute foundation for an incredibly beautiful emotional journey of painstakingly rebuilding a massive bridge entirely over our terrifying 10-year-old chasm. I proudly used the massive funds from the secret trust to immediately buy the building, entirely securing its future. Looking back at the whole completely chaotic, incredibly painful, entirely transformative journey, I finally understand that human beings are profoundly complex, totally capable of making absolutely horrific, devastating mistakes out of love. My father's utterly brutal, entirely devastating decision to completely disown me absolutely forced me to painfully walk entirely through pure, agonizing hell, but it absolutely forced me to entirely discover an absolute, completely unbreakable inner emotional strength. I completely learned that absolute true forgiveness isn't about completely, entirely erasing the painful past, but about bravely, entirely choosing to absolutely write a totally different, incredibly beautiful future completely together, despite the agonizing massive scars. Would you absolutely have the incredible, complete strength to entirely forgive someone who completely shattered your world if you finally discovered their utter cruelty was actually a desperate attempt to save you? Until the next story.